So yeah, what I want to do in this talk tonight is really just sort of go through what's happened over the last 2.5 years, and just summarize the impacts that avian flu have had on wild bird populations here in the UK. I think it's been extremely visible across pretty much all of the UK, but it's really only when you start to put it together you realize the scale and the magnitude of the sheer numbers of birds that have died. And really at the moment we're only sort of touching or sort of got very reduced, or the estimates could be a lot better because there are minimum in terms of the number of casualties. So I'll just give you a bit of a background into what avian flu is, and it is a really diverse virus, and it comes in two forms. So you have the low path version, and that occurs naturally in wild birds. It's been around forever. It's in poultry as well, and most individuals will show few or no clinical signs. So it's essentially a virus that's circulating pretty much all of the time. And then we have the high path, which is has a much bigger impact and a much higher mortality in terms of poultry and wild birds. And this evolved from a low path virus. The virus is called the H5N1, and it was first seen in a goose farm in 1996 in China. So really, that's the origin of the current outbreak that we're seeing globally, and it causes huge economic damage. Millions of chickens, ducks, and geese would have been culled or would have died because of this disease. And wild birds have really become the unwitting victim of this disease that has developed in an agricultural setting. Some species and individuals are more tolerant to it, whereas others, mortality can be extremely high. So although it's first seen in 1996, since 2014, high-path avian influenza viruses, that's HPAIVs, have become increasingly widespread across the globe. And if you look at the maps on the right, you can see the location of outbreaks in wild birds and poultry from April 2020 to 21, which is the most recent outbreak. So essentially, it originated in Asia and Europe, spread into Africa, and then it's now spread, if you look at the bottom map, across into North America and South America. And really the only place that it hasn't been found is Australasia. It's even been found in Antarctica, where a lot of brown skuas have died. And one of the really concerning and interesting things about this new strain of virus is that it's had a much wider impact on different groups of species. So it infects wild mammals, or in fact, infects mammals, and pretty much every species of mammal in the UK has been found with avian influenza, and it can be fatal and is. For example, in South Atlantic, elephant seals have been particularly susceptible, and hundreds of individuals have died there. But in the UK, things like foxes, badgers, even seals, dolphins have been found with the virus, and particularly those species that will scavenge carcasses have been susceptible. So avian flu, an awful lot of money goes in from governments into the agricultural sector into combating this disease, but really it's a significant threat to wildlife. And I think it's really only in the most recent outbreak that people have really woken up to this, and there's been a much better coordination between government, vets, human health people, and wildlife and conservation organisations. And really, we are working very closely together on the impacts of this disease and looking at ways of managing it and trying to prevent the spread in the wild bird population. So why are we concerned about avian flu? Well, the UK hosts 8 million seabirds, and they're all facing increasing pressures. So seabirds are generally under threat. And one of the characteristics of the latest strain is that it's moved from its traditional hosts, wildfowl, so ducks and geese, for example, and it's moved into seabirds. And I'm sure you remember a couple of years ago, very large mortalities of gannets were reported, with sort of thousands dying. And it's impacted other species like gulls and terns over the last couple of years as well. So we are concerned especially here in the UK, because we do host a very significant proportion of the global population of a number of species. So, for example, we host 80% of the Manx shearwater population, 60% of the great skewer. And if you just hang on to that figure about great skewers, I'll come back to that in a minute. 56% of the organic populations, over half the global population, the UK is responsible for. Almost 40% of lesser black-backed gulls, 34% are shag, and so on and so on. So the UK is an extremely important place for breeding seabirds. And because this disease has spread into many of these populations, we are extremely concerned as to what impact it's having on these populations. We're also concerned because of water birds. So we know traditionally that ducks and geese were particularly affected by avian flu, high-path avian flu, but also it's been recorded in shorebirds. So several hundred red knot died in the Waddenzee, for example, were picked up dead. But the UK is responsible for some really very significant numbers of water birds. So, for example, over 1 million geese, almost 5 million shorebirds, almost 4 million gulls, and so on and so on. So if avian flu gets into these populations, it has a real possibility of doing some damage. And one of the things we've been really trying to do is measure the impact of what's been going on. So what data do we have at our disposal to actually look at the impact of avian flu on our wild bird populations? So the UK government tests for avian flu in dead wild birds, and the Animal and Plant Health Agency and DEFRA are responsible for that. So if you phone the helpline and say, well, I've got a dead raptor, or I've got 5 dead geese on my local pond, they will triage that, and then they will decide whether they want to collect those carcasses and test them or not. And that's where a lot of the it's very detailed information about the virus, how it evolves, et cetera, comes from. The UK nature conservation agencies and the NGO sector are really focused on monitoring mortality in key sites. So, for example, national nature reserves, local and county reserves as well. And the wardens will monitor the mortality and report that through a database which has been set up. There's one for Scotland and one for England, Wales, and Northern Ireland as well. So we are collecting that data on a regular basis, and weekly updates get sent around. And at the height of it, we were having hundreds, if not thousands, of birds being reported each week. Now things are quietened down a bit. We might get just a handful of cases being reported. And then we've got the BTO population and demographic monitoring schemes. So things like the ringing scheme. When we start to see an uptick in the number of dead ringed birds being reported to us, we kind of get an idea that something's happening, something's up. The Wetland Bird Survey, so WEBS monitors water birds around the UK, both inland and coastal, and that provides some really useful information about changes in numbers of birds on sites. We've also had the Goose and Swan Monitoring Programme, which looks at abundance and productivity, and the Seabird Monitoring Programme, in association with RSPBs, we're looking at abundance and productivity around the UK. And that Seabird Monitoring Programme has been particularly important in the last few years in looking at the impact of the virus on our breeding seabirds. So if I just go through the sort of the headlines, really, sort of the timeline of what's happened over time. So in winter 21-22, we had some major mortality of the Svalbard breeding population of barnacle geese, which winter on the Solway, and approximately a third of those died. And there was some mortality in pink-footed geese as well. And this was pretty big news, a big headline, but it was fairly typical of the virus. It impacts wildfowl particularly, although the magnitude of it was higher than might be expected. Avian flu is normally a disease of autumn and winter. It's just like human flu, and in fact, sort of major human flu pandemics would have come from avian flu or via wild birds or via pigs. So it's not surprising that it behaves like flu in humans. What was really a big surprise to us was in summer 2022 was that it jumped seasons. So it didn't stop in March, April time. It actually carried on and switched into the seabird populations. And we had huge mortalities in the great skua population. Over 4,000 birds were reported dead as carcasses. And if you think of a marine seabird, we must have lost many more out to sea as well. So that's a minimum figure. Gannet reports of about 22,000 dead birds. Again, a lot of birds would have died and washed up dead on beaches and not been found. So again, that's um, a minimum figure. There's also significant mortality in the gulls and terns, particularly black-headed gulls, auks like guillemot, kittiwake, common Arctic and sandwich terns. Each over 1,000 to 2,000 individuals were reported dead via the various reporting schemes. It then moves into winter, and again we had significant mortality in the barnacle and pig-footed geese populations, particularly in Scotland. Herring gulls were also impacted, and between 500 and 1,000 mute swans were picked up or found dead over the course of that winter. So again, significant mortality, but not the tens of thousands that were found the previous summer. In summer 23, we were hopeful that it might not carry on, but it did. We had some major mortality in black-headed gulls, and we had about 15,000 birds being picked up dead. One site had, I think it was 7,000 or 8,000 birds died, and dealing with that number of dead birds on a site is quite tricky. How do you deal with it? Do you leave them there? Do you pick them up? How do you dispose of them? How do you incinerate them, or can you incinerate that number? Do you bury them? Do you put them in landfill? There are all kinds of health and safety regulations around this. So dealing with some of these outbreaks was really quite tricky. Again, major mortality in guillemots, terns were hit again, and herring gull as well. Now, move on to 2024. We saw very little mortality over the course of last winter, and we've seen very little in this summer. Although last week at a meeting, there was a few great skuas were reported with H5N5, which is a different form of high-path avian flu over the course of the summer. And we are receiving reports of reasonably high levels of avian flu occurring in the continent, particularly sort of Germany, Central Europe area. So it may well be that we're in for another wave over the course of this winter. I think the next few weeks are going to be pretty critical in terms of determining whether we actually have another set of major mortalities this winter. These are just a few figures from the government testing lab. They are quite selective in terms of what they test, and these figures are quite old. They're probably about a year old. So if anybody reports an outbreak or a mass mortality, they will test a few individuals. They won't test everything because it's an expensive and time-consuming business. So they will test maybe for the gannet, for example, if a few thousand birds died on in one of the colonies, they would collect, I don't know, half a dozen and maybe test those, and then assume that the rest died of avian flu. But these are the species that were particularly hit: Canada geese, mute swans, species that you might think as being fairly typical. But interestingly, common buzzards, they tested 124, which were found to be positive. And this is, I think, fairly typical of scavenging species which have been impacted by this disease. So there is some evidence that buzzards were impacted, but also other raptors as well, which might feed on infected birds. So there are various studies, for example, in terms of buzzards and peregrines, which show sort of higher turnover recently in breeding populations, which suggests that breeding adults are dying from this and then being replaced by younger birds coming in from the sort of the floating non-breeding population. It's also interesting to look at the numbers of species that have tested positive. So over 70 species of bird have tested positive since January 22. Mostly seabirds, water birds, and as I mentioned, raptors and scavengers as well. So it's pretty widespread. It's even occurred in a reed warbler. Quite how reed warbler picked up avian flu, I don't know, but yeah, it is quite surprising that the range of species that have been found dead and tested positive with this disease. If we look at the raptors, yeah, 300 were tested and 139 were positive. So over half the individuals sent in for testing were found to be positive with avian flu. So it does suggest that the buzzard population has been impacted. Now, buzzard is a very common species now, so it may not have a massive population impact, but in terms of numbers, probably quite a few birds were impacted. But even things like white-tailed eagle, of the 11 tested, 5 were positive, so just under half, and so on and so on. So things that feed on sort of small mammals like kestrel, and small birds like sparrowhawk, had a much lower prevalence of avian flu when tested, and these individuals were sent in. So just to sort of show you a timeline, we have a timeline on the bottom starting from December 21 on the left-hand side to July 23 on the right-hand side. And these are the number of carcasses that were reported in the various mortality monitoring schemes that were been set up. So, for example, if you look at, go back to the slide, a gannet in June 2022, almost 16,000 gannets were reported dead during that time period, and then again more in August and September after that. And what seems to have happened is avian flu seemed to hit each colony at different times, and I'll go on and talk a bit about that. The great scale mortality was really, really impactful on the population. Over 4,000 birds were picked up dead, over 1,000 on Fula alone, which is our main breeding colony. But what's interesting about these two seabird species is that they were only impacted in 1 year. Now, quite why that is, whether they gathered immunity or the disease didn't get into the colonies after that, we don't know. But it is interesting that it was just one hit, and then 23, we saw very little mortality. Whereas in other species, so for example, pink-footed geese, in the winters of 21-22 and 22-23, we saw repeated mortality between the 2 years. Guillemot's typical seabird pattern of just mortality in 1 year, although we have had some unexplained mortality more recently, and that could well be due to food supplies rather than avian flu. And again, you can see the barnacle geese on the left-hand side. Gulls and terns were generally impacted in the last 2 years, so 22 and 23. Quite large numbers of sandwich terns, so over 2,000 were reported in July 22. So we are talking sort of hundreds or thousands of these different species. If we look at the Solway counts of the barnacle geese on the Solway, we can look at the population impacts using the Web's data. So we're moving away from the carcass data and getting onto some of the other monitoring schemes. And you can see the sort of the blue and the grey lines show the number of birds indicated on the left-hand side across a typical winter season over the last 5 years. And the orange one is the 21-22, which shows that at the beginning of the season, numbers on the Solway, wintering on the Solway, were relatively normal within the range that you would expect. But by the end, there had been a significant drop in the Web's counts, showing that there had been a large mortality over time, and that matched up with the large number of carcasses that were picked up dead along the coast of the Solway. So we can get some idea of the amount of mortality that this disease was causing. Black-headed gulls is an interesting case. In 2023, they were impacted to some extent on the previous year in 2022. But in 23, there were really very large numbers found dead. And we had an index case in 2023 at Rutland Water. So if you look at the map and the blobs, that's basically a timeline of the disease. So at the end of March, sorry, end of February, sorry, end of March, we had a case at Rutland and one nearby. 2 weeks later, it has spread across the Midlands. It's spreading north by the end of April. And then by May, it was pretty much across the whole country and into Northern Ireland as well. And it eventually got up into Scotland, although there aren't many black-headed girls up there. And as I mentioned earlier, one site had 9,000 dead adults and 8,000 dead chicks. And we were really worried about this because once it gets into freshwater systems, the virus can lie around dormant for quite a long time, and it had the potential to impact a much wider range of species. If it's in a seabird colony, they tend to be fairly isolated. The birds tend to be going out to sea rather than inland, and so the risks to other species may well be less. But if it gets into freshwater for an inland breeding species, we were really worried, and luckily it didn't seem to spread too much into other species. So these are just some sort of headline figures for the carcass data. You can just see the very high numbers. So 22,000 gannets, for example, 15,000 black-headed gulls, 13,000 barnacle geese. Guillemots were impacted with 2,000 in 22 and almost 5,000 in 23. Similar numbers to kittiwake, and so on and so on. And so it really, very large numbers of birds, which you may not necessarily see, were being impacted by this disease. We can look at the ringing data to help estimate some of the mortalities, especially in particular colonies. This is literally just looking at the number of recoveries coming in over time. So you've got years along the x-axis along the bottom from 2011 to 2023, and then the dots represent the number of recoveries received to the ringing, reported to the ringing office. If you look at the bottom left at common tern, for example, you normally get less than 50 reported ringed birds reported to the ringing office each year. In 22, that was 150, and then in 23, it was 400. So you can really see that the reporting of the number of dead ringed birds to the ringing unit could actually be quite a useful metric to monitor changes in mortality over time and over a relatively short time period, because people tend to report dead birds fairly quickly, at least within a few weeks of the bird dying. You can see we've got evidence for increased mortality in black-headed gull, which is what you might expect. But other species, for example, common gull, there was no real evidence of any uptick in the number of dead birds being reported as ringed to the ringing office. And the pattern varies between species, so it's high for gannet in 1 year, then goes back to the sort of normal numbers the following year. Fulmars didn't seem to be impacted. You see high numbers in other years when there are fulmar wrecks, but avian flu didn't seem to be a major problem for them. Great skewers, again, very high impact. Over 200 dead ringed birds were reported. And if you think that a fairly low proportion of the bird population is ringed, that really translates into a very large number of dead birds. Guillemots, yes, you can see higher numbers in the bottom left. Herring gulls didn't seem to be particularly affected by this. And so on and so on. So sandwich terns, another species we know that was impacted quite badly. We had a sudden increase in the number of dead birds reported to us, whereas a burrow nesting species, which is quite, I wouldn't say solitary, but it doesn't congregate, and it will live in its burrow, fly out to sea, then swap with its partner. Doesn't come into contact with other storm petrels in a sort of a closely sort of packed environment, like a flock of gulls, for example. we wouldn't necessarily expect to see high levels of avian flu in this species because of its behavior. Moving away from seabirds, there wasn't much evidence for increases in the numbers of dead-ringed birds being reported to us, except in red kite in 22, where we saw an uptick. And again, we think it's this scavenging behavior of red kite, which they may have come across a load of dead carcasses and thought, yippee, this is great, and then caught avian flu and died. So we think that's the mechanism through which these birds would have died. We can do some individual case studies here. So we're looking at gannets. All the UK and Irish colonies were impacted. And what we have here is the number of dead-ringed birds reported to the BTO ringing scheme for Orkney and Bass Rock, and then to the Channel Island bird ringing scheme in Alderney. And the two lines, well, so the x-axis represents a year from the 1st of January to the end of December, and the blue line represents the number of cumulative number of recoveries reported in a using a 10-year mean, so a 10-year average. So generally, for example, if you look at the Sewell one, you might get 2 or 3 birds reported throughout the year, but really very low numbers. And there's no real particular sort of seasonal pattern in the reporting rate. Whereas in 22, you can see that trajectory up until April was normal, and then on the turning point here is the 20th of May, you see this massive uptick in the number of dead ringed birds being reported to us, indicating that mortality was occurring around this date. Bass Rock, the middle one, you can see was a week later, or 10 days later, and the change or the uptick suddenly started at the end of May, on the 31st of May. And then further south in Alderney, it wasn't until July, so some sort of 6-7 weeks later, that we started to see birds die. And this is a colony I worked in for many years, and it was tragic knowing that it was coming. We just didn't know when it was going to hit, and all the northern colonies were being affected, but eventually it hit us at the end of July, which may have been better for us because the disease had a shorter time to take hold, as it were. So I'm just going to focus in on Alderney because this is the colony I know best, and we've been ringing there for the past, well, probably 50 years at least. There's been a whole series of ringers from Guernsey and Jersey who've been contributing to the ringing effort there. The big red dot is the location of the colonies just off Alderney, and the small red dots are the location of all the dead recoveries that we got. And this is fairly typical of what we might expect in the breeding season, of where birds might go and where they might be found. We also had a little concentration around Helgoland, and we know that our birds in Alderney, the colonies are getting full, and young birds don't really can't find space to actually settle, so they move elsewhere. And the colony in Helgoland was colonized maybe 20 years ago, and we know that quite a few of our birds have been found there breeding. These birds ringed as chicks have been found there breeding. And also we've had some birds up in Arctic Norway, again, where new colonies are being formed, and our sort of colony, or birds, chicks coming back from our colony sort of 4 or 5 years after ringing, looking for a place to breed, can't find space on the rocks, and so they've moved and found other areas to breed in. We can do a survival analysis and look at just what the survival rates are and what the impact it's had on this population. I don't really want you to sort of take too much notice of the exact numbers here, but essentially on the left-hand side, you can see the years, and the number in the column next to the years is the number of chicks that are ringed each year. And then because we've done a survival analysis before, we know what the survival of the chick is and what an immature bird survival is and what an adult survival is. and we can work out the numbers of birds likely to be alive in future years. So in 1983, we ring 622 chicks. We know mortality is quite high in juvenile gannets, and so we would have expected 267 of them to be alive. Based on the survival analysis, we know that it's likely that 254 would be alive the following year, and so on and so on and so on. And what we can do is we can actually work out the numbers of birds in each of these cohorts that will still be alive in 2022 or were likely to be alive, and then plot that against the age structure of the birds that were found dead. So this is the number of, on the x-axis, we've got the predicted number that we thought would be alive from each cohort, and these are the numbers of dead ringed birds reported in that cohort. And there is a straight line. What's interesting about this is that there seems to be exactly the same mortality. It doesn't matter what the age of the bird is. So the mortality was similar across a 30-year-old bird or a 5-year-old bird. And what this suggests to us is that these birds had no prior knowledge of this disease. There's no immunity. It's a completely new disease to them. And so this is why we're seeing the mass mortalities, is because none of the individuals, even the sort of 30, 40-year-old birds, had any immunity to this. So it is a novel disease to them. And we've seen this across other species as well. So this new disease has the potential to wipe out a significant proportion of the population. We can do some maths based on the known reporting rates, the proportion of ringed birds that we found dead, etc., etc., etc. And we can work out, based on the reporting rate, which varies from year to year, what the proportion of the population that died in that 10-week period from when the birds were first dying at the end of July to when the colony broke down in October and they dispersed. And we reckon that a fifth to a third of the birds died in that 10 weeks to the end of October. That equates to 3,500 to 4,300 adult dead gannets. If you lump that up, it's 10.5 to 13 metric tons of dead birds from one colony. It's absolutely huge numbers of birds and a very high biomass. Productivity was down in 22, as you might expect. But what's interesting is that it did vary. Productivity last year in 23 was up. Again, this could be something like a density-dependent effect. So fewer birds, more fish, greater numbers of chicks. We just don't know, but it was high. And we calculated this literally 10 weeks after the birds started dying. And I think there was some skepticism that number of birds had actually died. So what we did, what the Alderney Wildlife Trust did, was do a resurvey of the colonies in 2023. And we've been doing aerial surveys every few years anyway, so we had good data on previous numbers of birds. And you can see that the two colonies, there's TAC and ORTAC, one colony lost 20%, one lost almost 50%. And so overall, they lost 28% of the birds between 22 and 23. And that fits in very well with the ringing analysis. So ringing has a real use in assessing the impact of these mass mortality events on populations. And it can be done very quickly as well. It doesn't have to depend on waiting a year to get a plane up to do an aerial resurvey of the colony. And if you look at the changes in numbers over time, from the colonies were colonized in around 1940, and this graph just shows the change in numbers over time. You can see that in Laissez TAC, you can see the drop between 21 and 22, and that equates to the population 20 years earlier at the beginning of the 2000s, whereas the change in ORTAC's numbers takes them back to the mid-1970 numbers. So really significant changes in the populations of the gannet colonies. And we Ordinary Wildlife Trusts do productivity monitoring. They monitor a certain number of nests each year and look at the outcomes. You've got 6 different parts of the colony. This is on NASOTAC, where they've actually monitored productivity. And productivity in 22, we're looking in the sort of in the top left-hand table. Productivity is normally around 0.5, 0.6. In 2022, it was 0.28. But interestingly, it wasn't consistent across the colony. So one site had a productivity of 0.47, which is sort of normal, whereas others had 0.18, which is very low. And these numbers represent chicks per pair. So 0.18 is about 1 chick every 5 pairs, for example, whereas 0.47 is 1 chick per every 2 pairs. And you can see the clear gaps in the colony that appeared in 22. We've got some photographs from 2021 above, which are repeated in 22. And you can sort of see these gaps appearing. And you can see them appearing across the colony, like a small gap, and then like sort of concentric circles going out where birds had died. So it wasn't consistent across, mortality as well wasn't consistent across the colony. Right, so looking at some of the count data, especially the seabird monitoring program data, where volunteers go out and monitor seabird colonies and have done for many years. JNCC started this and ran this for many years, and then they passed it on to BTO in the last year or so. So we've been using the SMP data to look at historic changes over time. SMP covers a very large number of sites, both inland and coastal. You can see on the map there. And these are just a few of the sort of headline figures. So this is great skier on Hander up in Scotland. You can see a very healthy growth rate from 1990 up to sort of 2015, 2018, and then a massive decline because of avian flu in 2023 from the mortality in 22. So the population dropped from about sort of 270 pairs down to under 50 pairs. Really very massive decline in great skuas. Productivity was also down as well. This is great skier on Fula. So productivity on the right-hand side dropping to virtually 0 in 2022, and numbers dropped from sort of between about 1,800 down to 750 pairs. So a very large decline in great skua populations. So this obviously the thing to do is to do a resurvey of these colonies, and RSPB led a multi-partner project and did a huge amount of work in getting field workers to the site and collating the results and analysing them, and to estimate the impacts of avian flu on breeding seabirds. Now, it's a huge job, and so they didn't monitor everything everywhere, and they focused in on individual species, which were particularly important and were known to be impacted, and also prioritized those sites where we had recent data as well, so we could actually look at change over a reasonable time period and not a colony that was surveyed, say, 20 years ago, where numbers may have changed for other reasons. And so the ones in bold are the ones where the species that we're focused on. These are the sort of headline results. There's a lot behind this sort of spatial variation. So some areas of the country were more affected than others, but overall, these are the headline figures. So a 3/4 decline in great skua population. And if you remember back to my introductory slides, you'll remember that we hold a very significant proportion of the great skua population, about 60%. So that means that 45% of the global population was lost in the UK alone over the course of 1 year. So for a a species like this is a very, very significant impact. And it wasn't just impacted in the UK. The Scandinavian breeding colonies were impacted as well, and the Icelandic and Faroese populations as well. Gannets were, again, significant amount of mortality, 25% decline in the UK population, represents 14% of the global population. Lesser black-backed gull, we lost 10% of the global population just in 1 year. Sandwich terns, 3%, great black-backed gull, 2%. And then you get to the more abundant species where there was less mortality, and in global terms, the impact was less than 1%. So really very significant impacts for a few species. There are other ways of looking at this as well, and so we wanted to look to see whether we could use birdwatching data to look at wider impacts. We know that avian flu has impacted seabirds elsewhere, so what we wanted to do was to look at Sea-Watch data to look to see whether we could pick up a general signal in the decline of seabirds on Sea-Watches. And Tractallon provides an excellent platform on which to record sea-watching data, and there are a number of sites that have recorded sea-watching data over a large number of years on Tractallon. So we used that data, and thanks to everybody who gave us permission to use their data. So this is the list of sites which we use data from, and you can see from the map, the location of them on the map on the left. So they range from the Forth down to Dungeness, so covering pretty much the east coast, the whole of the east coast of England, and up into Scotland as well. There were 19 sites which had at least 5 years of data, and we compared counts from 22 or 23 with the previous 5 years. And sea watching is notoriously variable, largely down to weather. So we controlled for weather to look to sort of try and take weather out of the equation and look to see if we could actually get a population impact on the sea watching data. These are the species that we had enough data to model, and the dotted line in the middle is the counts after the avian flu impact as a percentage of the baseline. So 100 means that we recorded similar numbers after and similar to before, so no impact at all. The ones in red were significant changes, and you can see again the usual list of suspects: so great skuas, black-headed gulls, sandwich terns, cormorants, and interestingly, fulmar seem to be, or counts seem to be lower after the avian flu outbreak than before. But other species, for example, Manx shearwater, increased, and quite why that is, we don't know. Manx shearwaters aren't particularly common in the North Sea, and it could just be down to particular weather conditions causing that. The other species, yes, we could detect change, but it wasn't significant over time between the two time periods. If we look at the figures and compare it between the RSPB resurveys and the sea watching analysis, the figures are actually fairly similar. So the RSPB estimated that 3/4 of great skuas declined because of avian flu. The sea watching analysis put that at 68% decline, so very similar. Again, gannets 25% versus 23. Sandwich tern 35 and 33. Black-headed gull is an interesting case. The mortality estimated from RSPB's resurveys was much lower than the sea watching analysis, but the resurveys took place before the major mortalities took place in the black-headed gulls, and could explain that difference. So just to summarize the sea watching data: large declines seen in gannets, skuas, terns, cormorant and fulmar we think are probably part of a longer term decline, and it was really useful to actually analyze the data and actually be able to use it to look at population impacts. And this is something that could be more regularly done in future to look at changes in seabird populations. So just to summarize, really, avian flu has been present particularly in waterbirds, seabirds, raptors, and other species, particularly mammals as well. This is one of the really worrying changes that we've seen over the past few years, and the spread from winter into summer as well. This ability to jump seasons and species is really interesting. It's a really interesting disease, and it seems to cause a surprise almost every year. So it's got it in cattle. That was the big news earlier on this year in the States. We haven't seen that here, but it's certainly a possibility. Mortality is variable across species, and we think that things like the density of flocking, the use of fresh water, etc., the sort of behavioural traits are really quite important in determining which species are hit and which ones are not impacted quite as much. The long-term population monitoring schemes have been crucial in determining the impact, especially of the seabirds, that this disease has had. So there are lots of research questions which we don't know the answers to at the moment, and these are the things that we want to follow up in the next 2 years. So how does avian flu move between species and colonies? And really, we need global or regional studies to do this, particularly tracking, which is very useful in showing us how birds move between colonies. Why are some colonies or species hit harder than others? Again, we think it's down to various species traits, but again, it'd be useful to know more about that. We know very little about immunity. We know that immunity does occur in some gannet populations, for example. You may well have seen pictures of gannets with black eyes. Now, avian flu affects the nervous system and the brain, and the eye is really an extension of that. And there are quite a few, up to 30% of birds in colonies, certainly in the colony I work in Alderney, with a completely black eye, which we think means that the bird had avian flu and has survived. And they seem to be doing all right. They seem to be fishing and bringing food back, but they do look very strange because gannets normally have this lovely pale blue eye. So having almost like a zombie gannet with a completely black eye is very strange. The role of mammals in the recombination of avian flu and new variants is something we know little about. So, for example, pigs can catch avian flu, and the virus can change and recombine, and new variants can form. So we need to know more about that. Impacts on scavengers. It's pretty anecdotal at the moment, but it does seem to be a fairly widespread view that scavengers are particularly impacted. And we need to know more about the long-term effects. And one of the things we want to do is look at our data probably next year to look at the longer-term impacts of the disease. One of the really, I'll say, good things is maybe it's not a good outcome. Well, it's a good outcome, but it's not in a rather poor circumstances. Is that our interactions with the commercial poultry sector, the veterinary sector, and the human health sector have really improved, and there's a lot of communication there between the different agencies, and we work with and partner with all these different people to take a One Health approach with input from across the different sectors, because everybody has a vested interest in understanding this disease from a commercial poultry perspective, veterinary perspective, conservation, or even human health, given where human flu pandemics have comes from avian flu viruses. So what are we doing? We're producing a special issue of bird study in 2024, which will be out in December, with papers on the outbreak in birds not only in the UK but also elsewhere. So look out for that. This will draw a line under the emergency response, and we'll move to a longer-term surveillance in the absence of another outbreak. But as I mentioned earlier, there are worrying signs from the continent that we may be in for another year or another winter of outbreaks. And then from probably next year, probably from 2025, we'll be looking at our longer term monitoring schemes in more detail to look at the impact and try and figure out whether there are some species that we might have missed, might have been impacted as well. I'm going to leave it there. I just want to thank everybody and all the different partners that we work with for help in trying to understand this disease and coming together, sharing data. And it's been a really interesting experience working with all these different organizations to try and better understand this disease. I'll leave it there.